From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Now I have the honor and pleasure of introducing you to a well-known illustrator and author, Melissa Sweet. Melissa is herself some writer and some illustrator. Pardon me for taking liberty with the title of her latest book, Some Writer, The Story of E.B. White. Okay. Melissa has illustrated nearly 100 children's books ranging from board books to nonfiction titles. Born and raised in New Jersey, Melissa graduated from Caldecott College and the Kansas City Institute of Art. Her artwork has appeared not only in books, but in the New York Times, Martha Stewart Living, Madison Park Greetings, and Smilebox. Melissa has received many honors for her illustrating and writing, including 2 Caldecott Honors, a Sibert Medal, the National Council of Teachers of English Orbis Pictus Award, the Stieglitz Straus Award, and the Cook Prize. That's a lot of honors, don't you think? Yes. Okay. Reviewers have described her unique mixed media illustrations as creative delights, and I would agree. From her first job illustrating the Pinky and Rex series to her latest adventure in authoring and illustrating the life story of E.B. White, Melissa Sweet brings to her readers breathtaking art, well-researched and designed nonfiction books, and now the masterpiece biography of E.B. White. Written for preteens, but I'm 66 years old and think this wonderful book will appeal to readers of all ages. I now present to you Melissa Sweet.
Good morning. Thank you for that lovely introduction. They've made me above these microphones. I feel better. It's good. So, salutations are in order. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and to introduce my new book, Some Writer. But first, let's take a listen to E.B. White reading from Charlotte's Web. I think our sound that's okay. Maybe we can hear it at the end. I had a beautiful audio of E.B. White. I don't know if any of you know that E.B. White did the audio version of Charlotte's Web a number of years ago along with Trumpet of the Swan. And so I listened to that for about 3 years nonstop while I was researching this book. So young scholars, as Stuart Little often called his students, often ask me where ideas come from. And the idea for this book came innocently enough. I was walking my dogs, as I do every day, and sometimes ideas come easy, and sometimes you have to go after them. This one just popped into my head one day as I was looking for my next biography. I wanted to do another biography. I'd done a few, and I love the research part of it. Life is always a rich and steady time when you are waiting for something to happen or to hatch, E.B. White said. And one of the things I discovered in researching this biography was how much E.B. White loved eggs of all kinds. So the book begins and opens with eggs. He wrote a chicken primer, and of course, Charlotte lays the eggs in the doorway of the barn, which was the inspiration for Charlotte's Web. Immediately, questions came up that had to be answered. I wanted to know, how did he come up with the idea for Charlotte's Web? How many drafts did it take him to write the book? And living in Maine, I knew that he loved Maine. How young was he when he first came to Maine? And most importantly, what were the names of all of his dogs? So, some of his dogs have the same name as my dogs. We were totally different kinds of kids, but we had a few things in common. When E.B. White was older, someone asked him what dime novels he read when he was growing up. And he said, "Never read a dime novel. Spent my youth on a bicycle and in trees." We had that in common. I spent my youth on a bicycle with dogs. I loved to go to the library, but I was not a particularly great reader. It doesn't mean I didn't like books, but I didn't love reading as much as I did making art and playing with these kits that you see. Who here had spirographs and etch-a-sketches? Yes, me too. So paint by numbers and color forms and all those things, these things that look like toys, are really wonderful design teachers. So I was learning to make design. I was kind of preparing myself to be an artist. Anybody here grow up in the New York metropolitan area and have John Nagy for so a few hands up there who taught us how to draw on Saturday mornings? And of course, I go to my studio all the time, more preparation. The artist Teresita Hernandez says that making art is a solitary process, and it is. So every day I go to my studio just the way people go to work, kids go to school. I go to my studio. Early on in my career, I read that Joyce Carol Oates said that she wrote for 4 hours a day, and I thought, if it's good enough for Joyce Carol Oates, that's good enough for me. So my studio is part library, part kindergarten classroom. I have everything I need to work there all day long, and I do work probably more than 4 hours. My materials are very simple. I don't do any of my art on computer. It's all by hand, and it's typical watercolor gouache, found objects. So I'm either writing a book, or I'm illustrating a book, or I might be researching a book. But whatever I'm doing, so long as I'm in my studio, I feel that I'm working. So we'll move on from here. How to begin a biography of one of America's most beloved writers? Well, I went back home after I had that idea, about 5 minutes later, and I took the book Letters of E.B. White off the shelf, and I began reading everything he wrote. I went to Cornell, where he went to school. I actually saw his farm in Maine, although it's not a public place. The family brought me there, and of course you can see the title on this book. This book is revised and edited by Martha White. Martha White is a neighbor and friend of mine in Rockport, Maine, and she was generous enough to talk with me fairly early on. I had done quite a bit of work before I talked to her, but we'll talk more about that. And I had some preparation with biographies. I had illustrated The Right Word, which is about Peter Roget, the man who invented the thesaurus. He was a list maker as a kid. So in any biography, who are these people as children? Was anything ever hard for them? What were their defining moments that led them to become the person they became? I wrote and illustrated The Balloons Over Broadway, the story of marionette maker Tony Sarg, who invented the Macy's parade balloons, and Horace Pippin, who was a self-taught artist, and he, as a soldier in the war, lost the use of his right arm, yet he went on to become an American master. So all these people had hardships and difficulties along the way to get where they got, and I think that is such a riveting part of the research and part of the story. And lastly, William Carlos Williams, and I'll show you a little bit about how I break open a book in my art. So a lot of my books, a lot of my art has books in it, and this is the spine of a book that I've taken apart, the cover which I've painted on, and then I place it on the background, and much of my work can be seen as a grid. So the grid is what I hang my art on, like a scaffolding or a skeleton. Design is not just about making things, it's about making things happen. And this was absolutely a series of teamwork between Houghton Mifflin and myself. I do things, give myself assignments. I made a timeline. I made a family tree using a real tree. Why not? Just pull a tree out of the ground and use it. I had the pleasure of, as I said, of visiting the farm, and I mapped the farm to give myself a sense of where he lived, and also looking for ways to tell the story with maps, and so I don't have to say he went cross-country after Cornell. I can show where he went and what happened too. If there was one object, though, I found represented E.B. White, was the essence of his work, it was the typewriter. But do kids know what a manual typewriter is? We put directions at the beginning, and I use the manual typewriter in these chapter openers. This is an example of an early chapter opener where there's a typewriter key and E.B. White's quotes, and then at the bottom is a label. So also using office supplies like you might have had at the New Yorker. E.B. White wrote so many essays and beautiful letters, and as the research went on, I wanted to use those quotes within the book. So I typed them up on a manual typewriter, and I consider these a hinge into his writing. My text goes along, and then you come to one of his quotes, which furthers who he was as a writer and part of his life. Young scholars also want to know, how do I make those big collages, and how do they get in the book? Well, I start with a form, and I do a lot of sketching, and you'll see a little bit here how I created one particular collage for the Stewart Little page. And I'm doing a lot of sketches, and I'm trying to make that scene where he drives his car and he ends up at a general store. And my husband said, I wanted to create this scene of a porch. And I said, should I make a porch out of wood? I don't know how to do this. And he said, no, just give it porchness and it'll work fine. So I'm making all these pieces that are going to go into the collage. And again, you can see I'm taking apart a book, and I'm faking a book that's going to go into the collage. There are dozens of things that don't get used. I've made Stuart Little's wonderful birch bark canoe. I've made his bed made out of clothespins. So just like when you're a kid and you're playing dolls and you're making all this stuff, I think that just never ended for me. I'm just continuing to make these collages, these assemblages. So I think we don't have time to see this whole thing, but it ends up looking a bit like this. You'll see in a second, I think. There, so that's the end, the finished collage, after much pushing around and pulling around. He worked for the New Yorker. Some surprises in that research were that he shared an office with James Thurber. And the two of them, James Thurber, who would become a famous humorist and cartoonist, Thurber was as gregarious as White was reserved. And he also, at the New Yorker, met his future wife, Catherine Sargent Angel. Catherine Angel was the fiction editor. They found love and married. She's also the mother of author Roger Angel. One of the things I love most in E.B. White's writing is the elements of style. That book came to him when he was at Cornell, written by William Strunk. We think of it now as Strunk and White because years later, later in his life, he edited and revised it. So Elements of Style became Strunk and White. Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Catherine and E.B. White spent the latter part of their years at their farm in Maine, and that's where he conceived the story for Charlotte's Web. I'm not sure we're going to have time to tell that whole story, but in essence, there was a sick pig, and the pig sadly died. As they tried he tried his best to save the pig's life, but he died, and he said, I knelt. I saw the pig was dead and left him there. His face had a mild look, expressive neither of deep peace nor deep suffering, although I think he had suffered a great deal. He buried the pig and later said that I wanted to find a way to save a pig's life. A while later, he saw a spider spinning a web in the dooryard of the barn. And he took that nest, I said a web, a nest. So she had laid her egg sac. He took it back to New York. The eggs hatched. All these little spiders were all over his dresser. He discovered that the spiders were Aranea cavatica, and that he spent the next couple years researching spiders. So he had these two very divergent episodes. Later, he was taking some slops to the barn, and he thought, what if a spider could save a pig's life? He wrote his editor, Ursula Nordstrom, has there ever been a spider as a main character in a children's book? Not as far as she knew, not since Miss Muffet. So the story of Charlotte's Web was born. It was illustrated by Garth Williams, who struggled with anthropomorphizing Charlotte and giving her a spider's face. E.B. White ended up accepting the more scientific rendition of Charlotte, and at the end, E.B. White added 3 hairs and 2 eyes to Charlotte, and Charlotte was born. There were many first drafts. He started off starting the book with Charlotte. Charlotte was a big gray spider living in the dooryard of a barn. But then he changed to Wilbur, the pig. I shall speak first of Wilbur. Another draft completely started completely with the barn and all the animals in it. And then he switched to the humans. John Arable went out to the barn with a lit lantern. Finally, setting the book aside, he decided to start the book with Fern, the little girl, and the last line, this penultimate last line was, "Where's Papa going with that hand axe?" Editing it down to "Where's Papa going with that axe?" So I love showing these 5 drafts in the book because it shows how he worked the way many of us work with editing. He was a consummate editor and reviser. He said Charlotte's Web is about friendship, life, and death. Stuart Little was about the quest for beauty. And Trumpet of the Swan was a love story, not just between Louis, the swan, and his wife Serena, but between father and son. So E.B. White's work is so accessible and so delightful. It was such an honor to create this book that incorporated a lot of his writings. I'll read you one last quote. We have time for one last quote. White writes, "Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say the weather is a great bluffer. I guess the same can be true of our human society. Things couldn't look dark, then a break shows in the clouds, and all is changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It is quite obvious that the human race has made a queer mess of life on this planet. But as a people, we probably harbor seeds of goodness that have lain waiting for a long time, waiting to sprout when the conditions are right. Man's curiosity, his relentlessness, his inventiveness, his ingenuity have led him into deep trouble. We can only hope these same traits will enable him to claw his way out. Hang on to your hat. Hang on to your hope, for tomorrow is another day." Thank you. We might have time for one question. We have 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Maybe some of you met E.B. White in your lifetime? Any hands up? No? What am I working on next? Wow, that's a great question. I don't know if this is public. I think it's fairly public. I'm working on a picture book that Kwame Alexander wrote. So am I lucky? Yes. Yes, completely different project, but I think that's the fun of writing and illustrating children's books. Each book is incredibly different. So thank you so much. I'll be here chatting with people and then signing later. Thank you. Have a great day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.